But it took more than a few madmen to create this world I was born into. It took faith in their madness.
Hello there, everyone. Before we get into painting some Australians, I thought I would give a little update as opposed to showing aliens threatening people to join the dork side. But believe me, I think that will be back at some point. I'm heading off for a few weeks, so don't worry. Miniature Dork Universe isn't going anywhere. Some of you might be relieved, and some of you might be like, oh no, he's coming back. I am. So, yeah, I just thought I'd let you know if there's a pause in the miniature dorktitude, that is what's going on in the grand scheme of things. So when I get back, I'm going to finish out my series of terrain videos that I put that post up a few months ago, the one about how I correct crappy resin casts. And I'm using terrain, but I mean, you could use the same techniques with any resin cast that's kind of crappy. So I'll show you the tools I use and the ways I get around some of those things that look pretty nasty on some of the casts. And what else was coming up? I feel like there was one more thing, but anyway, obviously when I get back, it's going to be right back into that, and then God knows what coming up after that. But anyway, thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more later on in the summer. Right then, the subject of today's painting video is going to be some infantry from the Australian 7th Infantry Division, 22nd Pioneer Battalion. So these fellas were transferred from Syria to Java in 1942. This was part of the Dutch East Indies at that time. Today it's present-day Indonesia. And they were part of an ill-fated collection of mainly Australians, and there was a U.S. artillery battalion and a British tank. I think it was just a squadron from the 3rd King's Hussars, I think. And yeah, they were pretty quickly overrun along with the KNIL. So that's just a brief little history. Let's get on with the painting. So these infantry soldiers would have presented something like this. More likely they would have been wearing shorts than pants, but there were long pants. They had the masculine name of Bombay Bloomers, I think. Nice. Anyway, yeah, I grabbed this image off the internet. I'm not sure what the source of it is, so if anyone out there does know where this image comes from, could you let us know in the comments below? Because I'd like to cite it for whoever produced this excellent illustration. And here's a few more illustrations. The one in the middle is also kind of unknown, but I'm guessing it's from Arms and Uniforms, published in 1975. And these illustrations were done by a couple, Lillian and Fred Funken. And of course the guy over here on the right is from the Osprey Publications Australian Army issue. And these guys are in Malaya, but I mean, the guys in Java would have presented exactly the same way. And this fella in the middle is a guy that was taken in Timor. So this is the early sort of tropical uniform that was common in the desert. And the jungle uniforms didn't come till almost a year later. At some point, the Australians in New Guinea were dyeing these uniforms like a greenish color. But during this period, they would have looked just like Africa uniforms. So you can also use this painting guide for North Africa. Just paint the helmets a sandy color instead of a green color. So we'll get into the colors that I used. I used a mix of Vallejo colors for my main painting colors, and then for washes, I used Citadel shades, they're called. So here's the list of Vallejo colors. If you want to screenshot that, you can get those colors or something similar. and there's the citadels that I used. So I'll quickly run through the colors and where they go, and then we'll get into more detail. So the overall uniform, I use Iraqi sand, and I feel like that's a good color in this scale to depict this sort of khaki drill that was used. For the webbing, I used beige. It's a nice sort of yellowy tan. And for this webbing, you could also use a number of colors. It showed up in sort of a more khaki color and this yellowy color. They used this stuff called Blanco to kind of clean it, but it also put a tint on it. So later in the war, they were using green Blanco, but in the desert in this period, and keep in mind these guys were sent straight from the desert, so I used the beige color. That being said, the helmets could have been left in a sandy color, but I chose to do like the British khaki drab or khaki green, and for that I used Russian uniform. For the metal on weapons and shovels and things, and for the bayonet frog, I used black gray. Being that this guy's a Bren gunner, that's probably a machete, but let's just say it's a bayonet frog and it's black gray. For any wooden components, I just use basic old beige brown. For the canteens and the Australian slouch hats, I use English uniform. Australians had brown boots, although I think black were possible as well, but for this I used burnt umber. And we'll get into what I use for flesh down the line here in a little bit. The figures I use to depict these guys are a mix of old Flames of War metal Australians for North Africa and some of the Peter Pig 8th Army. And Peter Pig has a variety of 8th Army figures from different nations. They also offer Australian heads with the hats, so you can do your own conversions, which is pretty nice. I polish these up with a round file and some fine sandpaper and a brass wire brush, like a very fine one, that polishes off all the oxides and stuff. And then I wash them to get any of the dust off and fingerprints, and give them a spray coat using just standard, hardware store metal primer. I went with gray because I want my colors to be a bit brighter than, say, doing black. Or when I do block painting, I usually paint the figures a really dark brown if I'm doing tans or browns or khakis. But in this case, I'm going to be using washes. And so this is a different kind of painting technique that I haven't really done in the past. But I've started to do it because it's a lot faster and it still looks pretty nice. We'll begin by starting the first flesh colors. So for this, I am going to use Vallejo Beige Red and just go around and obviously paint in all the flesh areas. And you don't have to be particularly careful at this point because we're going to put all the other colors in afterwards. So any little screw ups are going to get painted over anyways. And we're also going to be using washes, so that sort of cleans up anything that might look a little bit sloppy. Some people like to do the flesh at the very end, but I've always done it at the beginning. I find it's easier to paint all the other stuff around it and sort of get it out of the way. Something else I'll mention is that I don't use a wet palette. I use this golden retarder if I'm going to be painting a certain color for a long time, and this will keep the consistency nice without destroying the opacity of the paint. You just need a drop. Next up, we're going to deal with the uniforms. So for that, I'm going to use Iraqi sand. This is a very light color, so I put on 2 lighter coats. The second coat usually goes on pretty fast. But yeah. Also, I do think the gray undercoat might give it a bit of a grayish slight tone underneath, even after 2 coats. But I think in this case, that's a good thing. I do think this khaki drill color does have a very dingy, it kind of dingies it up. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. And we want dingy. Dingy, like the cogs of my twisted imagination. I'm going to do the helmets in Russian uniform, but you could just as easily do them in dark sand for the sort of North Africa color. Whether or not these guys actually took the time to repaint their helmets is in question, but often they seem to be depicted in green, but a lot of times those are illustrations. This is late 41 when they set out and early 1942. During 1942, the standard color went from the khaki green to like that shitty SCC2 brown, which was kind of like puppy poop. But yeah, that would have been later than this. So my next guess would have been this color, and I kind of like the way it looks. It's consistent with what we see in some of these books. However, those are illustrations. For the Australian hats and the canteens, I'm going to use English uniform. Seems to be a nice color for these. That guy's dome's looking pretty big. He's probably a miniature dork alien coming to recruit people to join the dork side. So now we'll move on to all of the webbing, and to achieve this I used Vallejo beige. I thought this was a great color for this version of the 37 pattern webbing. It could just as easily be, you could use khaki if you wanted to use like an alternate color. Just straight up khaki would be good, and then I would do the socks like Russian uniform or something, a different sort of beige color. But khaki looks good against this Iraqi sand, but in this case, like, the webbing color is quite light, so to achieve some sort of contrast is another reason why I went with this sort of color. But I think it looks accurate compared to the illustrations that we're seeing. But also I did look up online some actual examples of, the pattern 37 webbing in this sort of color. So yeah, I'm pretty confident in this color. This one is quite light too, so it's probably going to need a couple coats in areas where the gray primer is still showing through. Stuff that got painted over with your Iraqi sand should go nicely in one coat. Something else I should say too is I'm not using awesome brushes for this. When I do block painting, I'm using my very best brushes and really trying to preserve the tip. And it is a bit more time consuming because you're blocking in all the areas and leaving like a thin shaded line between all of the elements on the figure. For this, you can be a little bit more haphazard, and so in this case I think I'm using a double O brush where I usually use a triple O brush, and that's doing fine. And these brushes aren't my best brushes for sure, but it's nice. It's slightly bigger, so the paint is going on a little quicker too. Now we'll move on to the socks, and for that I'm going to use Vallejo khaki. Some of these guys have just straight up socks, and some of them have socks and gaiters. Yeah, but I think both are common, so what more can you say about socks? They're pretty bloody boring, but they jolly well look good in this khaki color. At this point too, you can start to see that the figure is starting to, the colors are starting to come together to show you what the final is going to look like. For guns and metal or stuff that's black, like the bayonet frogs, I use Vallejo black gray. It's a nice almost black color. Black looks a little bit too stark in this scale unless you're doing things like the vision ports in tanks or something, things that are in deep, deep shadow. But for things like metal or other black items, this is a great color to use. The Peter Pig figures that are in prone positions have no face, but it really doesn't matter. You don't see the face, so it's definitely not a deal breaker for me. But this figure also looks a bit like a miniature dork alien trying to promote membership to the dork side.
Like and subscribe to Miniature Dork Universe, or you will be forced to cut our head off.
For all the wooden stuff, I use beige brown, so that would be the rifle stocks, any of the spade handles,
I guess in the case with this figures, we're talking rifle stocks and spade handles. One of the casualty figures has a shovel lying on top of them, so I did the shovel handle with this color. There's a lot of browns you could use. Usually rifles are kind of a reddish or orangey brown color or tan, so beige brown is kind of in the middle of all of that. And yes, thus that's what I'm using, beige brown. The tip of the Bren gun, which I'm doing a really shitty job showing here, was sort of a hardened aluminum, and for that I start off using basalt gray, and then I'll lighten it down with some light gray later. For the boots, the Australians often wore brown leather, or mostly wore brown leather, so for this I'm using burnt umber. You could do a lighter sort of tanny reddy sort of color too, but I figured for the jungle sort of terrain they might be kind of wet and soggy and dark. Yeah, I do my jungle terrain sort of dark, especially the time of year that these guys were fighting was sort of the monsoon season, so yeah, went a little darker there. Now that all the main colors are blocked in, I'm going to use this cheapy Deco Art craft paint to do the base. If you've seen my videos, you'll remember how I use these cheap colors for doing my terrain. So I won't go into that whole spiel again. But yeah, I'm just going to fire this on, and I'm not going to be particularly careful. Just make sure you don't get it all over the boots. And I guess what I mean by careful is, you know, I don't care if it's not the most opaque everywhere, like it can be a bit crappy. It's just going to get covered over anyway. Lastly, I'm going to scrape the primer off the bayonet. So I had previously like filed and sanded and burnished it to get it nice and shiny. So I just carefully scrape that away. And it looks like focus is going to be a real dick. With any luck, it'll come back. So yeah, these bayonets, in some cases, I researched the bayonets because in some cases the blades are actually blackened like the rest of the gun, especially when it's like those like spike bayonets, like what the Russians would use or what the British were using later on in the war. But these ones seem to have a nice flashy blade, and they also end up looking quite a bit darker because they catch the reflection of everything in it. So even though it's quite light metal, it looks pretty good, I think. Now we're on to the washes, and for that I'm going to use these Citadel shade paints. So there's Agrax Earth Shade, and I use the technical medium to thin it down. You might have noticed in my previous videos when I thinned it down with water, it goes kind of cloudy sometimes, and I showed you how to fix that by using like a gloss varnish. But you can avoid all that horse shit just by using their medium. So I do about a 1-to-1 mix, which is what you're seeing here. And then I'll slather it all over the figure, but just on the uniform parts for the Agrax Earthshade. So you'll notice in the little picture up here in the upper right that it goes on kind of glossy. That's what it looks like after it's dried. So don't worry about that though. That's normal for this stuff, and we'll deal with that down the line. Then we'll use Reichland Flesh Shade for the skin and flesh tones. So just get there. You got to be a little bit careful, but you know what? I wouldn't worry too much if it gets over onto where the Agrax is, because it'll just go dark. So yeah, I didn't notice any areas where the flesh shade, which is a bit of a redder color, sort of bled onto the uniform, although I'm sure I didn't get it perfectly in the flesh areas. So yeah, the previous wash will sort of help you with that, and that's going to obviously go on the arms and the knees and the face. Our last shade color from Citadel is going to be Nuln Oil, and that's going to go on all the bigger guns. I don't bother with the Lee Enfield rifles, but when it's a a weapon that's mostly blued steel, like a boy's anti-tank rifle or a Bren gun, I'll give it a coat with the Nuln oil, and that'll just add a bit more tonal variety to the otherwise black and boring gun. Then I'll coat the whole thing with an AK Ultra Matte Varnish. Once the matte varnish is dry, I go around and anywhere that I want to increase the shading, like here you can see where the sleeves are folded up, anywhere where I want to do any sort of like line shading, I get a really good, this is a Tamiya really super fine brush, and I'll just add any extra shading. And any dark brown would work, like the German camouflage dark brown or whatever. But if you haven't bought all these paints and you're just getting paints for this particular painting project, you can use the same burnt umber that you use for the boots. It's so dark, and when you paint it in that small area, you know, I'm just adding some emphasis to the arms and the webbing and where the sleeves are folded up. For the flesh, I'm going to go back in with the beige red and just paint in any areas where the wash is a bit overzealous, and make sure to leave in the shaded areas in the Reichland Earth shade. Now that I'm on to the highlights, I'm starting to use a nicer brush. So this is a 3.0 brush, and I'm going to be a bit more careful with the highlights. However, this beige red is still a shade color, so if you do wank it up a little bit, don't worry. I wouldn't go back. Don't try and fix it by adding more of the Agrax, because then you'll have to come in and use more matte coat. So just at this point, be focused on getting her done. So the main flesh color is going to be sunny skin tone. So we want that to be the dominant sort of flesh tone, but still stick to the high points, leave the beige red in the low points, and I'll go along and do things like elbows and the, you know, the main part of the arms. I go across the knuckles. I'll paint in the fingers, but leave the shading in between. So again, you'll need a really nice brush and some patience. And the way you get good at stuff like this is just to do a lot of painting. And I found, like for myself, I got better when I stopped comparing my stuff to other people's work, because I look at other people's work and just get discouraged and bloody put it down. But then I'd pick it up like a month later and wonder why I was so critical of things. We get kind of messed up. So the best way actually to get good is just to do a lot of the thing that you're trying to get good at, and you will. So in this case, painting. At some point, you just develop a knack for it, and you'll get to a point where you feel good about what you're doing instead of being like super critical. Or I used to make sure that every single little flaw was painted in. It used to take me forever to get finished, and you don't even notice a lot of this stuff. So if you do have little errors here and there, I mean, just let it slide. At some point, you know, just get it finished. I think for me, especially, it was hard to get past that hurdle of just finishing stuff and having it finished. If I saw any little flaw or something, you know, I'd have to go back in and fix it. And ultimately, you know, it would get tedious and boring, you know, and I'd start something else. But I don't know, at some point it all just came together. And I wouldn't say my painting's the best, but it, you know, it really works for me. I'm enjoying it. For the highest highlights on the flesh, I just mix in some basic skin tone with the sunny skin tone that's left in my palette. So not straight up basic, because that's going to be too light, but mixed in. And I apologize, this section of video is total shit. I don't know why. Oh, I think it's because I left the palette in the background like a total wank. But, oh, and it looks like I'm not even painting in the camera. So, yeah, I plead ignorance here, but we already knew that. So, yeah, I guess you're just going to have to deal. Here's a nice little picture, though. This is what it should look like when all of your basic skin tones are in. Now, if you could see this bloody thing, you would see that I do the tip of the nose, the high part of the cheekbones, sometimes the chin, one of the lips. If there's something, significant to paint there, it'll add a bit of definition, like the upper lip. I do the fingertips, and I do the knuckles, and I actually paint the knuckles in little dots, like dot, 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 just to sort of imply that they're there. And it's a bit contrasty, but at a distance, it kind of looks good. This stuff is quite far away from your face, so I make it a tactic to go as contrasty as I possibly can. And again, I apologize for this total shit of a video. Now we'll go back in with straight up Iraqi sand on the main uniform color, and we'll just add the highlights, but ensure to leave in a lot of the shading that was left from the wash, and obviously if you lined in any areas. Although this is also a spot where you could clean up any potential mistakes that you made. So yeah, I do all of the colors. I go straight through and I don't worry about mistakes. And then at the very end, I take a good look at all the figures. And if I see something that's glaring, like something that's extremely noticeable from a distance, then I'll come back in and fix it up. For the final highlight, I mix a bit of white in with my Iraqi sand, and then I'm just hitting a very few areas on the highest points just to give a slight extra highlight. You can really overdo this stage, so just kind of resist the urge to go overkill, but just a few little spots here and there, and keep anything that's in the actual shadow shaded. Like, don't add any extra highlights to that. And here we go back in with the beige, and we're going to do the same thing as we did with the Iraqi sand and just start cleaning up the wash a little bit and leaving some of the shading and creating sort of our first level of highlight. The little picture up here on the right is showing the final version of the webbing with the beige after I've mixed white into. I didn't have time to do pictures for every single step, but I think you'll get the point. And like I just said, I've mixed white in with the beige. So for the very light colors like the Iraqi sand and the beige, just about the only thing that you're going to get any kind of highlight out of it is white. Because usually when I'm doing something like an olive drab or a field gray and I want to lighten it, I'll actually lighten it with these colors so that it doesn't look as washed out as just using white. But in this case, like I said, these colors are so light that you're going to need to use white to lighten them down. There's nothing really lighter, and they might wash them out, but I think with a sun-bleached tropical uniform, that's not going to be such a bad thing. For the hats, we'll come back in with our English uniform, and once again, just the straight up color will start to bring back the higher highlights, but you kind of want this to be the dominant color, just like with the Iraqi sand and beige. So just be careful to leave some of the shading in, especially in the deepest areas, and just brighten up areas on the high points. But again, you want to keep this color to be the dominant color, and then we'll lighten it down again with another color, which in this case is going to be stone gray. So I'm going to put in a little dab here and do it about 1 to 1, I'd say, and just mix it in really well, and then start to hit again just the very high points. You can go overdo it, but try to keep, again, you want your main color to be the English uniform. So here's a good example. English uniform's a bit darker, so I lightened it down with stone gray instead of white. If I had done white, yeah, it would look quite washed out. So how about you keep that in the picture there, Joey? No? Okay, there. It's a little better, but now Focus wants to start being a dick again. Focus, what are you doing to me? Getting close to the end, so here we're back with khaki. We're going to come in and do, once again, the highlight on the socks. We want to make the khaki, though, the dominant color, just like everything else. Just to come in and clean up the wash if it was overzealous anywhere, and to bring back that sort of khaki as the dominant tone. And then for the brightest highlight on the khaki, I just used straight stone gray. And once again, the little picture up there was just the final on the highlights. I didn't want to be doing like hundreds of pictures, but I think they kind of help to get the point over just seeing the painting, especially with my Focus being a bit of a dick. But then once that's in, they look pretty good. And as you can see in the picture, that khaki would make a good color for the webbing too, like an alternate color. And I've definitely seen it like that. We'll come back with the Russian uniform on the helmets once again to get the highlight, and we're going to make this sort of our dominant color but leave some of the shading. And for this, we're going to add beige for the high highlight. And here, this guy's already had the Russian uniform added straight up, and I'm just putting that high highlight. The English helmet's pretty easy. I guess in this case, the Australian helmet, you just paint that little high point on the dome, sort of a round circle, and then a little line around the highest point on the brim, and that gives you a nice looking helmet. Rifle stocks will come back in with the beige brown and the bayonet there. And again, we'll restore that beige brown on all the highlights. We'll make that the dominant color. And then we'll mix in some of the basic skin tone to get our high highlights. Just hitting the top edge of the rifle and using it to bring out any of the details that might have gotten hidden. And you just need little dots and little lines, and they'll go a long way for you. For the guns, I will mix the black gray with basalt gray, and then for the high highlights I'll just go straight up basalt gray, and then light gray will be for the Bren gun. So at the tip of the Bren gun, that aluminum part, I start with the basalt gray mixed with light gray, and then go straight up light gray for the high highlights. I thought I would just show it all done, then the painting process, it would just start to get long and tedious, and you can see how I've done the black part of the gun. For the boots, I took my burnt umber and I mixed it in with orange brown, and I went straight for the highest highlight here. I felt with the boots I didn't need to do 2 steps of highlight, and I just go in and carefully paint the raised areas and leave it looking something like this. And with that, I think we're getting down to our final steps of this project. For the shovel, I'm going to use a 2B lead, which is nice and soft. And just carefully, don't push too hard or you might scrape the paint right off the shovel. But if you go light and just keep going back and forth, you'll get that nice metallic sheen. So for things that have a broader metallic area like a shovel head, I'll use this as opposed to just painting in the metal like I do with the guns. But I find that that leaves a nice finish. The last painting step is to paint that little badge, a little badge in Vallejo gold. You could also do that badge in the dark burnt umber color. It seems like sometimes they patinaed that to, protect it from oxidizing or something. And there you have it, the finished product. So the basing, I'm not going to go into detail or the labels, but what I'll do is leave links in the comments below to videos where I do cover that. My KNIL painting video, I show you how I do the jungle floor. The arm of service number, the 75, I got from ChatGPT, so I'm kind of dubious as to whether or not that is actually a legitimate arm of service number because I've never seen it. But I have noticed that ChatGPT is kind of full of shit sometimes. Anyway, I like the way it looked and I put it there. So if you know anything about it, maybe let me know in the comments below. But at the very least, it'll be a conversation piece when someone says, "Where the hell did you come up with that?" I can tell them that's how ChatGPT screws you sometimes. Anyway, thank you for watching, and I'll be back after vacation with more.